Normally, I would be introducing someone else, so forgive me in this case for presumption of introducing. I guess I could say that really what I want to do is not to introduce myself. What I want to do is to introduce a book and a set of ideas, not so much something that you will see in the headlines, not about deliverables for the next summit. Of course, we do have a U.S.-Japan summit coming in November, but I'm not going to talk about deliverables. What I really am going to talk about is research that I hope we will find will last and that will open some new horizons in terms of the analysis, not only of Japan, but more broadly of how nations react to two central problems that countries in today's world face. First of all, the problem of economic growth. And secondly, the problem of responding to a globalizing world, which it seems to me are certainly they are two of the central problems of that nations, as they industrialize, as they transform, have faced over the past century and a half. And certainly these are problems that Japan have been central to Japan's own experience of the last, I would say, at least since the Meiji Restoration, and particularly since the Matsukata deflation and the beginnings of rapid Japanese growth, economic growth in the 1880s. So the subject is, in that sense, it's quite a large question. This isn't the first book that I've done that I've presented here. And we're right across the street from, of course, the major think tanks of Washington. And I have respect for what they do, but our enterprise, of course, is a somewhat different one. This being a university rather than a think tank, what we're trying to do is to look beyond the headlines, to look at a set of issues that a decade from now we might be able to continue to think about. In thinking about long-term issues, I've always been interested in something that will give us a sense for where the future is headed. Ever since I wrote The East Asia Edge in 1982 about the idea of Asia, the growth in Asia broadening beyond Japan to other countries of the region, that's what I've been interested in. One of those books had to do with energy demand and the ways that world energy demand would rise and then would transform global geopolitics. It would make the sea lanes, for example, more important. Another one, the New Continentalism, talked about how in the post-Cold War world, some big political changes, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the modernizations of China, would open the way to a new interaction across the continent of Asia, which has led to the discussions that we've recently had about One Belt, One Road and the transformation of China. I've spent a fair amount of time, of course, here in Washington over the years. And so what interested me was not so much, it was those deliverables. I was Japan chair, of course, at CSIS for 4.5 years. And so that every day to day, it was during the Gulf War, a lot of those day-to-day issues continued, they interested me then, and they certainly do today. But it was more the longer-term issue. How is Washington changing? And what does that mean for the nations of Asia? Are they particularly for Japan and for U.S.-Japan relations? Do they need to relate to that Washington in a different way? Who do they need to be in touch with to understand what's happening? So I've been trying to look at beyond the headlines at some issues that would be important in coming years. And this time, what I've been interested in is this puzzle that it seems to me has prevailed across certainly Japan's history of interaction with the world since the Meiji period, and particularly in the last 20 years or so. On the one hand, a period of explosive economic growth that continues for almost a century. And then, in recent years, from the difficulties that the territorial Japanese political economy, as opposed to some of its very dynamic international firms, which have grown to become global leaders, to some of the problems that Japan, as a territorial entity, has had in restarting its engine. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about what the answers to those two paradoxes, the paradox of growth, the profile of Japanese growth over the years, and then the response of Japan to globalization. Why it has occurred, in the way that it has. Some people would say, well, it was leadership. We had some great leaders and we had some second-rate leaders. Well, we've also had some mixed results even by individual leaders. If we take recently, for example, Prime Minister Abe's government, there are some ways certainly in which he has internationalized the Japanese diplomacy very decisively. There are some of his actions, his first and second arrows of his three-arrow global development plan, for example, which succeeded, I think, arguably in their early stages very well. And yet, there are other aspects which, where he had more trouble. I think clearly the third arrow, for example, about structural change has been more difficult. Some people would say, well, this is a matter of political reform. What you need is a change of political parties. And if you throw out, the existing conservative order of things and, let the DPJ or whomever it might be come to power, and that is going to solve the problems. Well, there were 3.5 years of a DPJ government in Japan between 2009 and the end of 2012, and there really was not a lot of structural change. There were a few significant changes. I don't want to say there are none. And it's interesting that some of those changes actually, I think, helped to understand the broader dynamic of what was happening. Well, in a nutshell, what I want to say, and I'll go into the details now, is that I think we've been focusing far too much in our understanding of Japan and how it relates to both economic growth and to the world on the macro, on thinking of Japan as a strategic actor, as one single unit. Japan thinks this or plans this or that. And we haven't been looking enough at the micro, that is to say, at corporate incentives, at group incentives, at the institutions of society, and how they go about affecting those incentives. I'll go into more detail about that, but I've never shaken hands with the nation state. As a lot of you know, I often say that. And I believe that that's quite fundamental to understanding. If we want an understanding of the world that is going to allow us to predict where the world is headed, that I think we have to look quite concretely at who it is that actually makes decisions in the world. Obviously, corporate executives are a key element of this. Political decision makers, if they are in some kind of position of authority, certainly they are also important. Thought leaders can be, for certain purposes, important. But what's important is to look at the groups in society that actually make decisions, and then to look at the incentive structures that determine what they do. I know that sounds a little bit abstract. I think this kind of analysis has some very important policy implications, and it also helps us to predict, I think, more accurately than many of the predictions we've made. Some of the things that we've looked at in the past, as I say, the evolution of the sea lanes, predicting that the sea lanes are going to be important to Japan and the world in future years, that there will be more imports of energy from the Middle East, predicting that the growth of Asia is going to extend beyond Japan itself to surrounding nations, predicting that there'll be more of an interaction across the continent of Eurasia with the other major countries, and relations, for example, across Asia to Europe and so on will become more important. Some of the things, and then predicting here, of course, the question of energy and growth and globalization. I think I'd like to argue that those kind of, this kind of analysis that looks at the micro and then at how institutions structure the incentives that people have can help us to do that sort of thing. Like I say, I know that's pretty abstract, so let me give you a few implications that I think flow from this, and then to go into some of the details of what I'm trying to say. When I served with U.S. Embassy Tokyo, I was assistant to our ambassador to Japan for 4.5 years, as many of you know. I was quite involved with the deregulation talks. And deregulation was a major focus of our U.S. government policies. I also, of course, we had trade negotiations going on and on and on and on. At some point, this was voluntary restraint agreements. At this time, some points it was tariffs. Deregulation broadly was the subject that we often considered. We didn't often get to issues like, for example, corporate governance. The thrust of some of this, I think, suggests, once again, maybe it's better just for me to generalize about the policy implications and then to go into the analysis, and you'll see a little bit more clearly about what I mean. But I think the implications of this are that what is quite critical is the incentive structures that different groups have to do what they want to do, and what the relative strengths in terms of the forms of organization that exist are. Broadly speaking, Japan is extremely good at cooperative organization and quality control and maintenance and nurturing a group consciousness because of the organizational structure, what I call circles of compensation. This is very good for risk sharing, for large-scale construction projects, for building steel mills, for doing the Shinkansen, for doing huge infrastructure projects, for reducing the risk involved in projects like that. It also, however, though, creates some disincentives for risk-taking. So a big issue, I think, for the Japanese political economy over time, and of course corporations, many of Japan's most distinguished and entrepreneurial companies, we have representatives of many of them here, have been able to finesse this issue. But the fundamental problem, because of the nature of micro-organization in Japan, is that it's very good at pooling risk and reducing risk for organizations, but it makes it hard to foster risk-taking initiatives. To make a long story short, I do think from a policy point of view that activities such as we are now beginning to see in the private sector, for example, between Silicon Valley and research pools or capital investment groups, the geodesic capital, for example, that former ambassador to Japan, John Roos, runs out in Silicon Valley, I think is an example of the sort of organization that takes, that builds on the strengths of both the Japan and the United States, which are rather different. U.S. organizations are much more capable and oriented toward risk-taking. Japanese organizations are better at pooling risk, neutralizing risk to undertake large-scale, capital-intensive sorts of projects. So there's a basis for U.S.-Japan cooperation, a profound basis. But I believe that it's much more in the form of joint projects of a variety of sorts than it is in the form of simply a radically integrated trans-Pacific or global political economy. That isn't to say that market liberalization and free trade and so on are not in there as basically good things. I do believe this. That isn't a argument for protectionism. And as I get into it, you'll see that I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that the relative opportunity costs in terms of trade policy, in terms of integration, economic integration, and so on, are much easier if one builds on the existing strengths and incentive structures of national systems than in trying to achieve a sort of radical integration that ignores those fundamental differences. I think Japanese organization has a deeply conservative incentive structure. It isn't that it doesn't change. Isn't that Japan doesn't modernize. Japan has responded dynamically to a whole series of major outside shocks. For example, the two major oil shocks of the 1970s. And it has some very entrepreneurial organizations, the trading companies, some of its bureaucratic organizations. METI has often been that way. And sometimes other ministries also. But there are institutional structures that we can't forget about that affect the things which are more possible and less possible. And those are very important to take into account from both a policy point of view and an economic point of view. I think much of this, to relate that to the current situation, whether in fact the outcome of the current structure of negotiations that have been agreed to between the committees headed by Vice President Pence and Deputy Prime Minister Aso, it's still not clear on the specifics. But I do think broadly this structure in which those baskets are configured, particularly the one that talks about cooperation. This is one of the first times that cooperation has been explicitly included as a topic of U.S.-Japan interaction. And it does seem to me that this could well be the basis for a more productive, less costly, if I put it that way, in terms of results oriented, more results for relatively less costs, political and economic, than some of the other approaches that have been tried in the past. Now, I know a lot of that is a subject for debate, so I look forward to that once I'm finished. Let me just say a couple of words about the intellectual evolution of this book, how I came to this sort of a view. I guess you might call it an eclectic sort of a view. It's not a radical market-oriented view. It's one where I think we have to take a look at organizations. We have to realize the bias of organizations not to change if they don't have the incentives. We have to create incentives for change before we're going to get effective change. Otherwise, it's more or less unlikely that we will get implementation. Well, a lot of this came from my limited experience, and I speak diffidently because I see some old friends whom I respect with long policy experience here. But my own experience, as I said, being involved with U.S. Embassy Tokyo in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, especially on the economic side, on the whole issue of deregulation, for example, and then involved in some of the other related debates about corporate governance and about border measures as opposed to other measures or alternatives to the traditional agendas that we've had. Also, I think taking a look at Abenomics and the way the policies of what has succeeded and what has failed. And failed might be too strong a word, but it's clear that there's, I think, been a mixed picture in policy in this government, and in American policymaking and strategy too. And that's happened in other cases as well. But I think those things, as this book was coming together, were influenced the way that I was thinking. It's been about 5 years that I've been working on this. Before I start, I should just say a word to two people who have played a key role in this. Together with, I should say, our visiting fellows at the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies and friends from the bureaucracy from Japan. I look also in my work at Korea, at Germany, at Singapore in certain ways. So I put Japan in a comparative context. Also, of course, from the business world. I would be remiss if I didn't mention many friends from the business world who are here. I should mention, though, Yun Han has helped tremendously, and Alex Evans, who those two particularly are here, who have, and of course many of our researchers since who've played important roles. I certainly appreciate all of the help that our researchers have done. So with that, let me just show you a little bit about some of the basic, structure of what I want to say and some of my conclusions. As I said, the challenge is understanding Japanese economic growth and the pattern of globalization that Japan has taken against the comparative context of three other countries that are also heavily dependent on imported energy and are also late developers in the international system. Okay, the basic concept is what I call circles of compensation. A circle of compensation is an organization that systematically internalizes the benefits to the members of the group and it externalizes the cost. Concretely, the building of a steel mill, I think, or an electric power plant, or any kind of mega project of that sort shows us some of those dynamics. If a steel mill, for example, costs $1 billion to take what it used to be, and it's gone up. Okay, you have 5 or 6 companies, and they all take a portion. The companies themselves regulate production, and they alternate in terms of their capital investment so as to reduce the risk that any one of them has to play. And they, if at the level of producers, it would be like that. If we're looking cross-industry at, for example, steel producers and banks and the government regulators and so on, each of them takes a responsibility and tries to share the burdens with the others, and so as to reduce the costs for the group as a whole. And the costs, to the extent that there are costs involved in this, those costs are externalized to someone on the outside. If a steel mill, for example, creates pollution, it externalizes the costs to the broader public. If an agricultural cooperative stabilizes agricultural production and stabilizes farmers' income, it could very well externalize the cost to consumers from the outside, either domestic or international. So this kind of a structure has great power in helping a group to undertake risky ventures and to apportion out the risk, and so that they can sustain those large projects. Japan, over the 1950s, 60s, 70s, of course, it moved very rapidly to a huge steel capacity production. In the next generation, it moved very rapidly into semiconductors. It created research cartels, for example, for the VLSI generation of semiconductor memories with larger and larger capacities. Many of these things followed this kind of a structure. There was also, of course, a regulatory aspect to this. And so I think one can see this simple form in many, many cases that I'll show very briefly. Now, you might say, well, isn't this just sort of human nature, and doesn't this occur everywhere in the world? Well, there are some historically particular aspects of Japan that make this more common in the Japanese context than others. And I stress structure, not just culture. Certainly the culture of being cooperative and going together and organizing things cooperatively at various levels. We see this. The anthropologists also will say this, but I think if we look across Japanese history, we realize that certainly there are periods in the Taisho period in the 1920s and so on when all of this was not nearly so true as it is now. Or if you go further back, the early part of Meiji or the Bakumatsu, the end of the Tokugawa period, this kind of behavior of pooling the risks and internalized benefits and externalized costs, it was just not nearly as common. Why? And is there any other international comparison to this? I think it's a product of the idea of corporatism. That is to say, the idea that the best way to stabilize economic development is to create a group that the government does not directly control, but that it indirectly gives subsidies and benefits to, and then to have that unit organize a particular sector of society or of the economy. A lot of this emerged around the turn of the century in the middle Meiji period in Japan. Some of it dates even from the Edo period. The the Tokugawa shogunate also used administrative arrangements like this. What's common across all of this is that regulation had a large element to that. It was also predictable. It allowed people to cooperate because they were not just cooperating once, but they were cooperating not only over a year or 2 years, but over 20 or 30 years, or even over between companies across the generations. That kind of a pattern where you can look forward to the future and you pool together sort of ichigan tonate, we'll all become one, became a pattern that was reinforced by a whole series of events across Japanese history, particularly from the early part of the 20th century until now. So some other countries, of course, did have this too. The so-called late industrializing nations. In Germany, for example, it was a relatively common pattern. And I found in the comparative work that I found that Germany and Japan are really quite interesting comparisons in terms of the way circles of compensation operate. I don't want to get too down in the weeds on, the technical details. Let me just say, functionally speaking, there are at least 3 different functions that these kind of circles play. Protection is one. And in the early days of Japan's industrialization, I think we have to remember that protecting against, competition and so on was a major part of this. That was one, especially in the early days. Stabilizing capital investment and so on, that was another. Also diffusing risk, reducing the risk so that you can do big things, so you can do capital investment and things like that. In banking, in finance, this was very common. In the days, particularly before liberalization in the financial shock of 1997, up until then, from the 1930s until the late 90s, you have this kind of a pattern. The commercial banks, the Bankers Association, long-term credit banks, insurance, Bank of Japan, Ministry of Finance, politicians, all of these kinds of organizations that were cooperating. Land policy, I looked at that. Again, construction ministry, landholders, part-time followers, developers, heavy industry, construction, stabilizing the land price and then borrowing very heavily against land for heavy capital investment. This is common right across the history of Japan. And these circles, supported by government regulation, were a major part of economic development. And land, it hasn't been well looked at, but I think that real estate politics and real estate policy is a very key aspect of Japanese economic development. And in general of Asian, you could see some parallels in Korea, in China, in Singapore, in several countries. So that was one of the ones I looked at. Food production. This is quite easy to understand. You increase agricultural production, and then you also distribute the benefits to other producers. There's a cost to consumers, business, foreign producers. In agriculture especially, this protection function has been relatively strong in Japan. As we know, the support prices for agriculture, they've declined. I'm not saying there's not change in policy, but the process of change has been relatively slow. This is the average for producer price for agricultural goods across the industrialized nations, the OECD. That's the OECD in general. This is Japan. It's been declining, but it's been declining relatively slowly. Nuclear power. as in construction projects. I think this has been a common pattern for in Japan. You pool the costs, and you externalize the costs, and if you have an accident, of course, there could be major external costs. But you internalize the benefits of the production system. Transportation, I think this applies there. Landing fees, for example, these are major Japanese airports. Landing fees have been significantly higher than they have been in other industrialized countries, and also Japanese ports. Germany, which is interesting, it has a somewhat similar structure, but the Japanese port charges, like their airports, have been relatively high comparatively. I argue that this is this circle of compensation structure operating again. Air transport, airport corporations, transportation ministry, local airports, the politicians. Strangely enough, the beneficiary of this has been other airports. For example, in Narita Airport has had trouble competing internationally with Incheon Airport or Changi Airport, some foreign airports, because the circles of compensation in transportation have favored the domestic, local airports and smaller producers at the expense of the more globalized international airports. Transportation or telecommunications, I think we've seen this. Business telephone charges have been relatively high, internationally speaking. This has affected Japan's information and technology exports over the last decade or so. Now, it seems to me one way to demonstrate the effect of circles of compensation is to take non-circle companies and how they have done. I took Rakuten, I took Yamato, the Black Cat, I took Unicharm, some auto companies, YKK, Kyocera, a series of companies that do not have large industrial groups or do not have large industry associations behind them, and the dynamics are somewhat different. As I said, I discuss this in detail in the book. People like YKK and Rakuten and companies like that. Now, I did comparison, and without going into details, this is an interesting chart on Index of Economic Globalization that was arguing that around 1990 was the high point for Japan in this regard. Singapore, very high on these indicators all the way through. Korea, but this is Germany. This is Korea. Both more stable, but in the case of Japan, that there have been relative to other countries, globalization has been a harder process. And I don't need to go into all the details. It's probably better to discuss this in the Q&A. But I do think that change and response to globalization has been more difficult because, ironically enough, that the same thing that has been a strength of Japan in the high growth period, namely the ability to pool risk, to reduce risk for individual companies, in an era of globalization when you have to respond so rapidly to new technology and product cycles are more rapid, is making adjustment for the economy as a whole more difficult. Now, there are solutions, and I think both the Japanese bureaucracy and also the Japanese private sector is seeing these possible solutions. So at the corporate level, Japan is finding it easier to respond, but at the territorial level, the response is more difficult. Let me give some examples. I mentioned geodesic capital earlier, and the large sort of technology investment funds that have begun to develop just in the last 2 or 3 years with Silicon Valley. They take advantage of this risk-oriented behavior, partly because of the tax structure, expertise, the role of incubators. There's a whole series of reasons, and I know that METI in particular has been giving priority as major Japanese companies, many of the trading companies, many the auto manufacturers, to this kind of a problem. But taking advantage of the complementarities in the two systems. A lot of the design for Japanese automakers, for example, because global trends, of course, move rapidly. Like other multinationals, they've set up design studios in Southern California, to kind of respond to some of those changes. Multinational corporations in their nature find this kind of thing easier to respond to. But the problems at the, in the non-traded side of the economy, it seemed to me, are fairly, or in groups that are not able to move territorially. Those problems are somewhat more serious. Transportation, communication, agriculture becoming some of the most serious. Another one, which is very important and important to look at, I think, is finance. The changes that have been happening in finance. The old system of finance that was, I think, supported innovation. In general, Japan was not so much of a risk taker, but you had industrial long-term credit banks, for example, that were in the high growth period relatively good at innovation. And the Industrial Bank of Japan, the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, some of the most important sources of innovation in the classical economy of the high growth period collapsed with the transformation of the Japanese financial system in the 1990s. And so the financial institutions were a big support for the traditional circles of compensation structure, but that became confounded following the collapse of the bubble and the collapse of the long-term credit banks. And I think some of the problems on the innovation side and so on that Japan has had are related to that structural change. Now, what about the future? In the longer term, if we think of the tremendous ability to cooperate, of the incremental innovation, Kaizen, the way to think holistically across industries. The robotics industry, for example, really came to flourish in Japan because of the ability to connect machine tools and mechanics and electronics in new and creative ways. The auto industry, Japan did creative things, but this is cutting across various sectors. And so, creating the incentives to do that kind of thing, and then broadening the circles of compensation, in short. I don't think circles of compensation, destroying them, is the answer to Japan's future or to the future of U.S.-Japan relations. In that respect, some of our traditional agenda, deregulation, radical deregulation, and so on, I'm not sure if this is really the answer to a stable U.S.-Japan or a trans-Pacific relationship, ultimately. It's a more hybrid situation that does involve some deregulation. It involves some restructuring for example, many of the good features of the old system in finance, some new functional equivalent for supplying long-term capital, I think, needs to be fostered. But in the end, precisely to my mind, because the United States and Japan are complementary to one another, not only in their strategic interests, but also in the structures of their economy. Not that they're the same, but rather that they're complementary to one another. That is the nature, and provided that that continues, there has to be some way to accommodate the major changes in the world that are underway with the rise of China and so on in a way that stabilizes the system as a whole. But it's a kind of complementarity, ultimately, rather than a radical globalist integration that is the ultimately the way in which trans-Pacific relations will be the most stable. So anyway, that is my 2 cents about why we get both economic development and also the patterns of globalization and so on that we have gotten. If people have questions, and I dare say there probably will be, I dare say this will be probably a controversial book in some ways, but I hope one that will look beyond the headlines and open up some new areas for research, particularly with regard to the trees in the forest, that will help us to understand the forest as a whole. So with that, thank you very much. I don't know if anyone has any. Yes, Professor Deming.
Yeah, thanks. I look forward to reading it. This is, sort of way beyond my competency in economics. But one question is, to what extent have foreign firms, particularly American firms, worked their way inside the circles of compensation, thereby reducing pressure from the outside because they're part of the game already, and therefore there's less incentive for foreign governments and others to push for change?
That is an extremely good point, and I did mean to mention it. That is exactly what has happened, and I think it's important to remember that the rates of return for American firms who have been located in Japan for a long period of time, 10 years specifically, are on the order of 5%, maybe about a third higher than those of newly arrived firms. Essentially, what has been happening is that Japanese regulation or Japanese corporate culture, there's a whole series of reasons for this, has been admitting selectively outside firms, if they have strong human relationships and so on, to these circles of compensation. And so it's been important to have, human relationships. Often former members of the bureaucracy have joined these companies. Not always. Sometimes it's just a member of their American or their foreign staff having long-standing ties in Japan. Often, former members of the State Department or American government agencies, have joined, or members of the Japanese bureaucracy have joined. But they've been very important. It's interesting that the ACCJ, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Japan, has actually been quite quietly effective. And those companies that have worked within that structure, sometimes their role has been limited. They've been profitable. Sometimes the role has been limited. They haven't taken markets over that in many other countries they've taken over. But they have been. Effectively what's happening is they're being admitted to the circles of compensation. This isn't the only country where this happens. I think if you look, for example, at the AmCham in Korea, that it's been common there. The U.S.-China Business Council, in a different way, has operated in a similar way in China. But the AmCham, I wouldn't want to say that this structure is just totally in an unrelieved manner protectionist, because it does have roots. It's not, I wouldn't say it's the pure free trade system as it's known, as maybe, well, I'm not sure you could say that of the United States. Look at, say, the dairy industry or something. But in any case, it's a mixed system that does have a place for foreign firms. I think is a very important point. And also offshore. I mentioned, for example, the design studios, say, that in Southern California that Japanese auto firms work with. Or, recently some of their research centers in, even in Detroit. There's the multinational corporations or the branches of Japanese firms in the U.S. or U.S. firms in Japan. They play an important function, in making the system stable. See.
Thank you very much, Professor. So you alluded to Japan's circles of compensation to the corporatism in the beginning of your presentation. And do you have any views on the reason why corporatism was much more successful or adopted by the Japanese more so than in other countries?
Again, you've got an extremely interesting question there. I think partly some of this is path dependent. In other words, if we contrast the case to the case of Korea, I don't think circles of compensation are as common in Korea as they are in Japan. But that said, some aspect of the way that Korean economy evolved over time allow them even in some areas to be stronger. Of course, the colonialism and then Korean independence and restructuring and a short occupation that was rather different in Korea from what it was in Japan. I think, there weren't the industry associations that are so strong in Japan, particularly take banking or steel, or many of the industries that mobilized in the 1930s. Those sectors have relatively strong industry associations, and of course in Korea that it wasn't structured that way. To some extent it was in the colonial period, but then that structure was swept away after the war. Instead, though, you have the chaebol themselves, the chaebol structure, a bit like the Japanese keiretsu, except that the occupation changed the structure of the keiretsu, particularly the holding companies that allowed for in Korea, this family control that's so much tighter. And the share of the chaebol is much higher in the Korean economy than it is in Japan. And also growth was more rapid for a long time. And there's a variety of historical reasons. So I think that progression, and if we look at Germany also, of course, had a corporatist heritage. It came out of Bismarck, and the concerns of the German economy. But again, after World War II, a lot of that structure was swept away. In Japan, it was transformed, and the zaibatsu were split up, the holding companies, but the industry associations, and particularly, I would say, banking. This is partly why banking became such an important part of the Japanese, I call it the banker's kingdom, structure of the Japanese high-growth period. The trading companies, of course, were broken up. The big zaibatsu trading companies, both the British, especially the British, they feared the trading competition with Japan in India and places like that. So they put strong pressure to break up the trading companies. And so, of course, they recovered after a decade or so, but there was a whole period of competition before that in the one-set shugi. It's sometimes called the one-set-ism. You got a group of competitive, fierce competition, but across a broad range of sectors. There wasn't quite the degree of control that I think there has been in the Korean political economy. The control was, to the extent it existed, more through the industry associations. Industry associations are very strong in Japan. Historically, again, there's been a change over time, but historically. Whereas, Germany has a bit of this. In Korea, it didn't develop nearly to that degree. And of course, I looked at Singapore is just not, it's a city-state. It's not really an economy in the same way. But that's a good question. It's, or there's other cases. Russia, Imperial Russia had some corporatism. But mainly, if you have a big revolution or you have a big shakeup of some kind, then it destroys this path. But in certain parts of the Japanese economy, it actually has continued. In finance, I think you really have to look to the 1920s, the Teijin Jiken and the financial, the earthquake of 1923, and the late 1920s is when the Japanese financial system or of industrial finance really began. So it's, it's an unusually strong pattern of corporatism, which is why circles of compensation are especially strong in Japan, but not just Japan. There's echo effects. I see this in Turkey, India, some of the Tatas and the industrial groups. I'm interested in the question of, where you get collective action of this sort in China. I don't know. I mean, other people will know better than I do about a subject like that. But, that's part of the research agenda that I hope this creates is, to look at it. What is the incentive structure that exists in industrializing nations, especially capital-intensive industrialization like Japan did? It was very successful. Maybe the thrust of what I'm saying, it might sound like I'm, not admiring Japan's achievements, but I'm in awe of what Japan has done over the years in terms of industrialization. And the circles of compensation were a big part of that. Yes. Yes, one of my sensei here.
No, really. Thank you very much for the very interesting analysis. Well, difficult to express in English, but anyway, I'm interested in difference between pre-war and after-war, post-war. And concerning the circles of compensation, can you find difference between the situation of circles of compensation before the Second World War and after Second World War? Because there are so many things changed. And the reason why I'm asking this is, I'm interested in your analysis. Is there something did you find something missing now, which should have been here today concerning the risk sharing, that kind of thing, risk taking or risk sharing. Some people may argue that, particularly before the Second World War, we may have had risk-taking spirit more, for instance.
Again, that's a really, really interesting question. Maybe first to take the question of what is missing. Well, I think maybe here I'm building on another book that I did called Strategic Capitalism, which was not really, that wasn't about with apologies to Meti, because I admire the trade ministry greatly for certain reasons, but I don't subscribe precisely to Chalmers Johnson's. They're sort of the big Meti school and the small. I'm more of the small Meti school. I believe that things were more indirect and that it was other institutions that often took the lead and were the coordinators, not kind of Meti over the top the way Chalmers Johnson presents it. The one particular that I point to, what's missing now, I think it's the Industrial Bank of Japan, or something like that. Now, many of you are, some of you are, and many of you are not familiar. I know Deng Xiaoping seems to have admired that institution, and Nakayama Soppei actually told me that he had, found an interest in that in China. But what it did, it did what business economists would consider to be a disaster. Namely, they borrowed short, or they borrowed short and they lent long. They lent out for steel mills and for 30 years and more, and then they borrowed money through 3-year debentures and 5-year debentures, very short-term money, relatively short-term money, and then they lent out for long periods, which is very, very risky. But, there, I think indirectly you have to say the support of government was important. But what they did was they were able to be coordinators in putting together, steel is probably the best example, but shipbuilding, petrochemicals. I did a lot of work on this in my strategic capitalism book. And where it wasn't clear where the group would go. Within a circle of compensation, one of the problems is decision making. Who's going to take the lead? How do you avoid Yoko Narabi, some kind of just everybody is not quite sure which direction to go? Well, of course, no doubt, the bureaucracy was part of this. But there's also a lot of cases, I think, where there was resistance to that. As I see the Japanese industrial history, I think there's a lot of resistance to the idea that the government should just go do it. That kind of a top-down idea, which I think Chalmers Johnson tends to present, was resisted. In many cases, resisted successfully. And so it was, even for Meti, it was easier to be more indirect or to defer to a Nakayama Soppei or somebody like that who knew the business world, who knew the political world, and could pull things together. So what was missing? In IBJ, of course, it dates from the Meiji period, and they were active in overseas, in China and so on, and Korea in the colonial days too. But then they came back rather remarkably after 1951, particularly. And I think, the fact that there were 4 of them, of those long-term credit banks, that they don't exist. China has 4 banks that have these kind of functions somewhat. To my mind, it's a question I ask is there some structural similarity to what China is trying to do in long-term finance to that? But I think for a developing country that has to develop core basic industrial capabilities, that kind of thing. And you say, what's different between pre-war and post-war? IBJ was there all along. So I'm not sure that the difference is really, there is one thing. I remember Eleanor Hadley once told me that Uemura Kogoro actually told her this of Keidanren once. He said he firmly believed that the source of Japanese economic growth was the dissolution of the Zaibatsu. And, she was a trust buster. And so she liked to hear that kind of stuff, I'm sure. But the competition, what you have is you have long-term financing like IBJ could give, And then you had competition. Like all of the major industrial groups with Japan were fighting each other to expand capacity. And so that was different. I think, if you look at the pre-war versus post-war, there's far more competition. And the Japanese economy is far more dynamic in the post-war. But so maybe it is. It's the continuity is things like the IBJ until recently, but the difference is this Zaibatsu structure. Yes.
So, if dissolution of Zaibatsu is the sort of the driving force of Japan's growth, then of course Korea should not have grown, because as you just pointed out, Korea's economy today mimics very much the pre-war Japan's Zaibatsu and big industrial groups. Germany did not have the same kind of dissolution of wealth as Japan experienced after World War II. My question is, was there a big difference between the cadre of economic, let's say, government that U.S. has sent to Europe under martial law, and a group which were largely socialistic who came to Japan? In fact, listening to Bernie Sanders during the election campaigns, I said, wow, he sounds like the post-World War II American economic team that came to Japan. And of course, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because the bureaucracies took over and did very well. It just suppressed individual wealth along with tax incentives and vice versa. But anyway, my
Well,
question is, what's
I
the
think
difference?
on the occupation and sort of who came originally and what happened, I think we have to remember that there's sort of two parts to the occupation. There's the original, Wilsonian impulse to make the world safe for democracy and to just dynamite the Japanese system. And then there's what happened with the reverse course, and especially after Kennan came to Japan, say, in early 1948, and the revolution was beginning in China and, all of those things. And on the first case, like Zaibatsu dissolution, that one occurred at the beginning, and Eleanor Hadley and all the trust busters were in New Dealers, and they were very liberal in their policies, and labor unions began to operate freely, and the Katayama cabinet and the Ashida, the socialists, came to power partly in that period on the strength of basically that reformist impulse of those New Dealers who came over. Well, I would say, and it tracks very closely with the Katayama cabinet itself and rising inflation and some of the economic problems that began to occur in Japan, and also the geopolitical changes that were beginning to happen in the region. And Kennan believed very much that Japan as an industrial center was crucial. Another thing is John Foster Dulles appointed and began to work on the peace treaty. And of course, as we began to work on the peace treaty, the question of Japan's economic recovery and stopping the inflation and strikes and all of this kind of stuff, it became there's a policy shift. And so I think it's fair that in the early stages there were that group of sort of Wilsonians or New Dealers who came to Japan, and they had a strong influence. But I think that began to wane by the middle of 1948. Also, when they saw, it seemed like the political scene was to some extent pluralistic, but chaotic in a certain way, depending on how you looked at it. And so then get a very different set of policies. And, stability and national security and all of those kind of things become more important. So it's both. There's both. There is what you say, but then there's a shift, I think, after 1948 to, and then Yoshida Shigeru comes to power, and then it's a very different story by the end of 1949. Yes. Professor Chan.
It's just, okay. Thank you. Thanks for this extremely thought-provoking and interesting talk. I'm not an expert on Japan, but I did read quite a lot of work that people use some previous terms such as communitarian capitalism or coordinated market capitalism to describe Japan, and I felt that the circles of compensation has captured something that previous terms that haven't captured, which is it is a circle, and therefore it always has a high level of coordination, and it's extremely hard to change. But as you also briefly mentioned, that the precise nature of globalization is that it calls for a lot of rapid change. So if that is the case, where do we see on the circle that it's likely to have an opening or a breaking point for change, and which agent precisely is likely to push for change or to push for reforms so as to let Japan better facing the challenges of the current economic situation? Would that be from the government or the banking sector or any other industries? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Who becomes the incentive, the agents of change? Well, the nature of the system, exactly as you suggest, has I think, a profoundly conservative bias, because it shares benefits internally. It gives you advantages to being part of the circle. And conversely, it creates costs. The costs are externalized. You leave the circle. If you leave it, the people who are the agents, it does make possible change by including new members of the circle. Take, for example, as Professor Deming was suggesting, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or certain foreign businesses, say, who have technology or something like that. You can add people or companies to the circle. And you could change the dynamics of the circle by the new entrants that you introduce. I think some of the people that, say, have joined Shingikai, advisory bodies of Japanese ministries, there's some long-time business people, even American investment banks who've joined the boards of Japanese companies, and they've become, in some cases, change agents. You say, who breaks the circles? The circles are very, very hard to break. Occasionally, you'll see people from outside of the system or entities from outside the system that become sort of guerrillas or independent actors, and they might tie up with politicians of some kind. At a certain point in time, Sony, for example, I think played that. Morita finally joined the board. He became one of the key directors of Keidanren and so on. I remember he wore mauve ties, though. He never had exactly the same color of tie as everyone else. But, and then you got recently like Mikitani or Rakuten, or that some of the companies I alluded to, YKK. There's a lot of these companies are funded by independent capital. They didn't rely on banks. It's interesting, the role of banks in circles of compensation. They've been the bureaucracy and the banks, I think, generally have tended to keep the circles stable. But sometimes you get these kind of renegades. Son Masayoshi, SoftBank recently has played this kind of a role. And what do? They tie up with outsiders. In some cases, in the case of Son, I know because I saw some of this myself, the bureaucracy, very interestingly, provides introductions or stimulus to aid some of these outsiders. I think they want them to be gadflies for change. That's out, but outside the structure. So the broad tendency tends to be for these structures to exist. But, there are gadflies occasionally. Sometimes they just develop independently. A lot of times they'll operate together with foreign companies. For example, Son helped to introduce Apple into Japan. And he's been, you've seen a lot of the things. He went to see President Trump, and he operates, to what extent this is coordinated, I'm not sure. Some of our Japanese participants could say better, but I think he has been one, or Mikitani is another, who've just operated outside the system to some degree. So it's unusual. But, it's not unknown, and it's becoming more common. What I think I should say is there's some powerful incentive structures to keep this kind of coordination going. But, it isn't everything in the system. There are some, renegades or change agents that are outside the system. We shouldn't forget that. Yeah. Jonathan.
Yeah. So I guess when I think of internalizing benefits and externalizing costs, sort of the first thing that comes to my mind is a cartel, and yet the defining characteristic of a cartel is that it's, as we see now with OPEC in so many instances, that members will defect at the first opportunity. And yet the characteristic of these is that they're incredibly durable. So what's the key difference between these circles and cartels?
Well, there you have, to me, again, one of the most important, interesting elements of the Japanese political economy. I think regulation is one major element of that. It isn't universally the case, but the way government regulates or the way political incentives are structured, or maybe it's umbrella. There are different layers of organization in the Japanese political economy. I go into some of that in the book. It's a multi-level game sort of situation, if you want to put it that way. So the incentives are, that's a very good question. The circle is a cartel. I wouldn't call it in all cases a cartel. It's a softer version. In many cases, it doesn't meet the illegal. It's not illegal. I don't believe you would consider them, in most of them, illegal, even in our system either. It's not that. It's a matter of softer coordination. It can have a regulatory sanction. That's one element too. In general, it's supported by regulation. Either, or if not regulation, by human relationships, rather than some kind of that maybe I've said enough. Good question.
Thank you very much.
Now
for
we'll get the real story.
I'm rather a small metty school of thought. So I know you gave us a lot of food for thoughts, but I'm not sure if I really understand the concept. But your theory reminds me of the, what do you say in English? Ronald Coase theory about the externality. So one of the idea is that the cost of transaction will determine the sort of, for example, size of company. So your theory circle reminds me of that thinking. So maybe it's if we think the circle as a
Yes.
sort of external line of the organization. So maybe that the transaction cost may determine the circle. So yeah, I'm just I don't know how to put it into question.
No, I see
but,
exactly what you're saying.
So my question is that the case? Maybe we need some change agent, but also maybe the market force may change the circle. So
Yes,
any comment?
Yes, no. I think that's right. The internalization of transaction costs is part of this. You have a circle, a group of people or a group of companies that have known each other over long periods of time, and they kashkari, they give and take with each other. And so, the transaction cost problem is less. Oliver Williamson calls, the institutional economics goes into a lot of those issues. And you say market forces could change this. Yes, it could be. Human networks and, in some cases, regulation, I think, tend to cause them to persist. Now, as regulation changes, I have no doubt that some of your colleagues, who have been proposing and supporting the idea of the third arrow and then the more recent policy developments, they would like to see these changed in some ways. And as regulation changes, I think this will produce an effect. As market forces become stronger, it will have an effect. Some of the institutional changes that have occurred, for example, in electric power, I think certainly are having some kind of an effect already. The political economy of electric power in Japan is profoundly different now from, say, what it was 7 or 8 years ago. But that said, human relations change slowly. Institutional networks may change slowly. The logic, the game theoretic logic, or the group dynamics logic of this is persistent. I think there's an interesting comparison with the work of Mansur Olson, for example, who, he said he always talks about defectors, about free riders, about why people have incentives not to cooperate with organizations. Well, I think in general, regulation and human networks, that the pattern of those things that exist in Japan and probably some of these other countries I look at, suggest a modification of that. It's not universal that in every organization, a large number of people have an incentive to free ride. If somebody structures the incentives in a way such that if you do that, you'll be punished or something will happen. So, and you said market forces. I can't help thinking regulation. I'm a believer in small meaty, largely speaking, but some kinds of regulation or something that influences the incentives that come from public policy probably has an effect in causing these to persist. And again, if you're trying to build a Shinkansen, if you want to build a steel mill, if you want a large research and development project, or if you want to cooperate with the United States and to do the a large-scale infrastructure project in the U.S., can you do this without some form of cooperative organization like circles of compensation? Well, I don't want to take too long. what I basically just wanted to do is, I know this is not the usual way of looking at the Japanese political economy, but I hope you find it's sort of halfway between a public policy discussion and a business school discussion of some kind, and a sociology discussion. It's kind of, it cuts in a different way. But anyway, I hope people have found it interesting. If you have time and you'd like to talk more, you're certainly welcome next door. We have some refreshments and everything, and I'll be more than happy to chat a little more. So, yeah. Well, for 40%, or for what? I mean, academic publishing one never makes any money, and it's 40. We have 40% off, which is exactly our cost. We're selling what our cost is. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Thanks.